Okay, so the live button is on. We're now just going to take a moment to make sure that we actually are live on X. Yes, we are. Now let me just pop over to YouTube and make sure that we're live there as well. And we are indeed live on YouTube, so that's great. And we are indeed, now, I'm coming to you today from Montreal, Canada, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. Nice to see you. We have a comment in the chat, which I'll just get out of the way right now. Bliss448 asked me if I've heard from Laith Marouf. He seems to have gone radio silent. He's fine. I actually understand he's in Greece and will be resurfacing soon. In any case, today we're not going to focus really on foreign policy. We're going to be talking about the budget that has just been released by the government of Prime Minister Goldman Sachs, as I affectionately refer to him, otherwise known as Mark J. Carney. And for that purpose, we are being joined by two guests who've been on our program before. We're very happy to have them. One of them has disappeared momentarily. It's Yves Engler, author and activist, and also a candidate, unofficially so, but nonetheless a candidate for the leadership of the New Democratic Party, the nominally leftist party in Canada's parliament. He's coming to us today from Halifax on the eastern coast of Canada. And we're also very pleased to be joined by our good friend, Radhika Desai, a professor at the University of Manitoba. She's in Winnipeg, Manitoba today. And her specialty is geopolitical economy. She's also a political scientist and astute political commentator. And she also worked with me. She was the person who had the most involvement and contribution, the greatest contribution to the formulation of my campaign's platform when I ran to be the leader of the Green Party of Canada in 2020. So Radhika has actually been involved in the front trenches of a fight for the leadership of a political party in this country. We came actually quite close to winning. So welcome, Radhika. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dimitri.
Just so everybody knows, Yves has momentarily disappeared because he was on his phone. His event ran a little bit later than he thought, and he's going to be switching to his laptop, but he'll be with us in just a moment. So just to fill you in on what's happened today, for those of you who have not been following the rather dry business of governmental budgeting, this is actually a quite important day in Canadian politics, and really, I think, emblematic of a lot that is going on across the West. It's not what happened today, and what the Canadian government is doing, the path it's going down is reflective of larger trends, I think, in the Western world today. But for Canadians, it's of particular importance. This budget that the government of Mark Carney, it's his first budget since he won the election several months ago, the federal election in Canada, is being tendered in a very challenging environment. Like so many countries around the world, Canada is struggling with Donald Trump's tariff war, and Canada is particularly vulnerable to tariffs because the U.S. is by far Canada's largest trading partner. And as a member of NATO, the Canadian government has readily capitulated to Donald Trump's demand for a radical increase in military spending. And Mark Carney has vowed to increase military spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. When he came into office, it was significantly below the pre-existing and very arbitrary NATO spending target of 2% of GDP. And Canada had perennially failed to meet even that target, which is, in my opinion, quite excessive. So, going to 5% of GDP is going to have really drastic consequences for the government's finances in the long run. And on top of all of this, Canada, like, again, numerous other countries in the West, is suffering from an affordability crisis. People are struggling to pay their groceries. They're struggling with the cost of housing. Fortunately, we don't have the same challenges here that Americans have with healthcare, but that is also becoming increasingly difficult to access healthcare of a reasonable quality. And this is by no means an exhaustive list of the challenges Canada confronts. So tonight we're holding this live stream to offer a preliminary assessment of Mark Carney's proposed budget. For this purpose, as I said, we've invited these two guests and accomplished guests. Can't think of two people who are better qualified to offer insightful commentary on this critically important subject. And before we begin, I just want to stress, by way of disclaimer, that this is a preliminary assessment I think we're all offering you of this budget, because this document, the main budget document that was released just 4 hours ago, is nearly 500 pages long. And I doubt that my colleagues had the time to dig into the fine print of this behemoth. I certainly didn't, although I scanned the whole document quickly. So with all of that as background, I'd like to start with you, Radhika. Every government budget must be based on certain economic predictions because the future performance of the economy can impact dramatically both government expenditures and revenues. And this budget states that it is based on an economic forecast that constitutes an average of private sector forecasts from major banks. And apparently this is standard practice for Canadian governments. And it goes on to state that the private sector forecasters expect, on average, real GDP growth of 1.1% in 2025, 1.2% in 2026. And it says, as the Canadian economy gradually adjusts to the new trading environment, growth is expected to pick up to about 2% in 2027 and beyond. And then the budget states, however, economic activity remains on a permanently lower trajectory, reflecting the combined effects of ongoing U.S. tariffs and trade tensions, weakening productivity, reduced business investment, costs from restructuring trade and supply chains, and the resulting drag on incomes nationwide. The budget further states that Canada's unemployment rate is expected to peak at 7.2% in the fourth quarter of this year and is expected to remain elevated and to only gradually decline to reach 6% by 2029. So basically, Radhika, this budget foresees very weak economic growth in the next 2 to 3 years, but it does not assume that the economy will contract in any year, essentially prior to 2030. What do you make of this economic forecast? Do you think it's too optimistic, it's too pessimistic, or it's just about right?
I think that the forecasts in themselves are already quite pessimistic, even for Western countries, which they have basically pegged growth at about half the levels at which Western countries were growing, say, in recent times. So already they are being fairly pessimistic. However, the Carney budget is assuming that its spending, the spending that it is announced for, the 86 billion or whatever it is of infrastructure spending and spending for this transformation and so on, that it's going to kick in and it's going to stimulate a lot of private sector investment, and that is going to increase the growth rate down the line, like a year or two down the line, and that, I'm afraid, is a relatively optimistic measure. I also agree with you, by the way, that even for the next 2 years, when the growth rates are pegged at relatively low levels, it is not clear to me that Canada will grow even at those rates, because the Trump administration, we still don't have a deal with the Trump administration. While, of course, because of the Canada-Mexico-US free trade deal, Canada has escaped at least some of the worst tariffs. It seems to me that compared with Mexico, Canada is getting, shall we say, stepmotherly treatment, which I think Trump is giving to all economies which are essentially peer economies. So the European Union, Canada, etc., they're all getting shafted. While at the same time, I think that Mexico is getting, because at the end of the day, getting the cheap products from Mexico is fairly important for the United States. So in that sense, I think that what the Trump administration will do in the future, it's not clear to me whether this growth trajectory, even of 1 and 1.1 and 1.2%, can be sustained.
Right. Now, I want to just hone in on military spending for a moment. And I have to tell you, and I tried to find a page somewhere in this 500-page document, again, scanning quickly in the little time available to me through the entirety of this behemoth, a page which set out the major categories of expenditure for the government in the coming fiscal year with military spending, a line item for military spending or defense spending, so that I could just readily compare how much money they were going to be committing to that, as opposed to, for example, pensions, healthcare, in civilian infrastructure. And I couldn't find it anywhere in this document. And I've tried this in the past, by the way. I've tried to find this figure so I could easily compare it to other major categories of expenditure, and I just couldn't find it. So there are a number, not much is being said about defense spending in this document, but there are a number of interesting graphics. So let me show you this one. This one says, as you can see the title, "By Defending Our Sovereignty and Security in an Increasingly Dangerous and Divided World, Canada must be ready to defend our people and values, to secure our sovereignty, and to stand as a strong, reliable partner for our allies." And then it says that the government is going to invest $30 billion. You can't see it maybe because this print is small. In the lower right-hand corner, it says this is a 5-year horizon. So it's $30 billion over 5 years, 20 billion of which is to go to capabilities, 5 to infrastructure and equipment, and 5 to industrial support. And then I found this document, this page, which is similar to, consistent with the one I just showed you. It shows defense spending 30 billion over 5 years. This is 5 billion more than the government proposes to spend over housing. By the way, I want to be clear, this is not the total military expenditure over 5 years. I believe that this is increased spending over certain aspects of military expenditure. It's not even close to being the total military expenditure. But even still, you can see from this graphic that they're proposing to spend significantly more on the military than on housing. And then they've got much larger figures for infrastructure and productivity. Okay, so I just, before I ask you to weigh in, Radhika, hey, could you clear your background? Oh, thank you. So then I found this chart, outlook for expenses. Okay, and if you go down this thing, there's no line item for military expenditure or defense spending. And you can see elderly benefits for 2025, 2026. This is the top line item. The second column, 2025, 2026, is 83 billion. Employment insurance benefits for 2025 and 2026 is 30.5 billion. Canada Child Benefits, 30.1 billion. But I don't see anything in there about military spending. It may be folded into some other larger line item, but there certainly isn't any explicit reference to military defense spending there. So having said all of this, the CBC, Canada's national broadcaster, reports that the budget is earmarking 81.8 billion over 5 years. This is much more than the 30 billion figure we just saw, to rebuild, rearm, and reinvest in the Canadian Armed Forces, with an emphasis on recruiting and retaining more personnel and buying new equipment. And this compares to a relatively paltry 13 billion over 5 years for new housing. Where the CBC is getting these numbers is unclear to me. But based on everything we've heard from the government, their number of 81.8 billion has to be much closer to the truth than that chart I showed you, which shows 30 billion. And Dave Perry, an expert on defense and the president and CEO of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, told the CBC that new military spending on this budget is the most money the federal government has spent on the military in generations. Quote, there's an enormous injection in just a 5-year period. You're seeing a huge reallocation in terms of what the federal government does, and more of it is moving to defense. It's a hell of a lot, close quote. This is somebody I think we can fairly say is pro-military spending, and even he is gobsmacked by the number. So with all of that as background, sorry, there's one other very, very important fact I let out of the discussion, and that is Canada's GDP in 2024 was approximately Canadian 3.1 trillion. And 5% of GDP, of last year's GDP, works out to about Canadian $157 billion. So if Canada were to spend 5% on GDP on the military in the coming fiscal year, that would be by far the largest expenditure in Carney's expense outlook. Just to go back and see it again, this is the expense outlook. You could see that 157 billion would be substantially more than elderly benefits, employment insurance benefits, and Canada Child Benefit combined. In 2025 to 2026, they come out to a total of about 144 billion. So military spending, if we were at that level now, would be substantially in excess of all those items. So this is truly, I think, a stunning reallocation of government resources towards the military. So, Radhika, I don't know that we have Yves, so I'll start with you. What do you make, first of all, of this claim that this massive increase in military spending is necessary for Canada's national security?
Well, of course, it's not necessary. I mean, this is being done at the behest of the Trump administration, which has been insisting that the rest of the world, the US allies spend more and more on the military. The reason why the Trump administration is doing that is very simple. The more allies spend on the military, the more contracts will be given to US defense contractors. And he is definitely, if he's anything, he's a spokesman for the military industrial complex. So that's the first point. I do believe, now the second point I want to make is that there are two things we have to factor in when you are looking at all these tables and charts and looking at the budget itself. It seems to me that the budget is very short on details right now. And secondly, it's also promised to divide capital expenses from operating expenses. So I don't know, I'm not familiar with the chart that you showed, but basically that means that, for example, if you're buying, so many fighter jets or so many ships or whatever, the cost of those will be depreciated over a long period of time, over their entire lifetime. So that means that the actual cost in any given year will not be registered in quite the way that you might expect. So having said those two things, I think that basically it seems to me that this budget is it's a continuation of neoliberalism, in the sense that not in the sense that neoliberalism is about free markets or competition. It's never been about that. It's always been about giving corporations greater privileges, greater subsidies, greater freedoms, etc., lower taxation, and so on. So it is the continuation of neoliberalism in our current multipolar age. And I'm packing in that expression, multipolar age, the rage of the Trump administration at the multipolar age, which has given rise to the current set of tariffs and so on. And so it's a continuation of neoliberalism in the multipolar age, in the context of a minority government. I think what the Carney government wants is that enough either a opposition party comes forward and supports it, which is partly why you see that there are, apart from relatively massive cuts to the public service of about 10%, you don't see a lot of attacks on social programs, because the main constituency that he's trying to possibly win over is, the NDP. having said that, we've just heard in the last couple of hours that a conservative MP has defected to the Liberals because he thinks, as I'm sure it makes complete sense to him, considering the amount of corporate giveaways in here, that it's a perfectly good budget as far as he's concerned. So the point I want to make is that both the infrastructure program and all the generational investment that Carney wants to make, and the military budget will constitute a very substantial giveaway, subsidy, tax break, etc., for the Canadian corporate sector. And this is exactly this is what he's asking the rest of the political spectrum to support. Oh, and one other thing is, of course, it is also a big giveaway and subsidy to the American military industrial complex, because when Canada expands its military spending, a very substantial part of it is going to go to American manufacturers of military equipment.
Can you hear me? Dimitri, can you hear me?
We
Yes.
can't, Eve, and I wanted to bring you into the conversation. We can't see you, unfortunately. I don't know if you can pick that. But let me start by asking you this, Eve. A member of our audience, D9X8B, says Canada doesn't even need a military. Who's to fight Canada? A perfectly legitimate question. How do you respond to Sam's point, Eve?
Well, I don't know if I heard it all, but I don't think Canada does need a military. I think that the reality is the Canadian military is not structured for defense. It's structured to assist the U.S. empire. And as I've said many times, every added dollar to the Canadian military is an added dollar to the U.S. War machine, both in the sense that the Canadian military is structured to enhance U.S. global power projection, but also in the fact that a large proportion of the funding goes to the U.S. military-industrial complex. So, Lockheed Martin Canada, General Dynamics Canada, Raytheon Canada, a big proportion of Canada's arms industry are branch plants of U.S. Arms manufacturers. But I think when we talk about the military spending and the scope of it, the Parliamentary Budget Officer 4 or 5 days ago released a report on capital expenditures over the next 20 years in military. And in that report, they showed that it went up $108 billion between 2024 and 2025, from $215 billion to $323 billion. That's just in the Carney, just from the new announcements Carney's made, it's gone up $108 billion. And usually the capital expenditure, it's about 3 times that in life cycle costs. So a fighter jet that costs $20 billion, it will be at least $60 billion over its life cycle. So that's towards $1 trillion over 20 years. What Carney has done with the military, I don't think people can underestimate how radical of a military shift he's made. And it's important also to note, contrary to what the CBC said, which is this business about underfunding of the Canadian military, in fact, during Trudeau's decade, the military budget doubled. It doubled in actual dollars, and it went from about 1% of GDP to 1.4% of GDP. And Carney, in his 6 months of being in office, he increased that from 1.4% to 2% of GDP, half of which is added money, like out the door before March, and half of it is sort of accounting kind of games. Because one of the things that's important to note when you talk about military spending is Veterans Affairs doesn't count in the Department of National Defense budget. So that's another like $10 billion, which is mostly pensions for former soldiers. So the scope of what Carney has done on military spending is just remarkable. The submarines that they're purchasing, completely discretionary. We're talking about towards $100 billion. The surface combatants, they talk about in Carney's housing announcement of 6 weeks ago, there was $1 billion for homelessness. The surface combatants that they're purchasing, just for the 3 surface combatants, it's $22 billion. So it's like for one of the surface combatants, it's about an eighth of what they were devoting for homelessness. it just goes on and on and on. The scope of the military spending is just absolutely phenomenal, and that isn't. We haven't even fully got down the path of the 5%. That's just the 2% of GDP that they've already committed for, and as you noted, they're going towards the 5%. But these are sums of resources that I don't think people have fully got their head around just how big a threat not only it is to the world in terms of greater capacity to intimidate and to wage war, but a threat to social programs and a threat to average working class Canadians in their living standards.
So I just want to add before we move off the subject. Thank you. Before we move off the subject of military spending, I mean, we always need to just, when we talk about the subject of Canada,
3. I don't know how you scroll down. Oh, Jesus. Yeah,
sorry. Let me just see if I can mute you. There we go.
All right.
Okay, maybe we've got it now. So we should always recall that Canada is really blessed from a national security perspective geographically. We border on one country, and that is a country with which we've not been at war for over 200 years, and we are closely allied with that country. Even if we wanted to compete with that country in military spending, we couldn't. So that would be a fool's errand, but there's no need to, because at least formally we're told this is our closest ally. And we're separated from the rest of the world by 2 vast oceans. And the United States, being the largest military spender and being so jealous of its own security in its own hemisphere, would never tolerate, even if we weren't a member of NATO, it would never tolerate the presence of a hostile, substantial foreign military force on Canadian soil. It would intervene forcefully to prevent that from happening, even if we weren't members of NATO. So this idea that Canada is threatened in some way by some significant foreign power, whether it be Russia or China, is just really a joke. It's an absolute laughable fiction that is being used to, as Yves said, justify Canada's ongoing outlays for participation in America's wars of aggression. And that's pretty much the whole story for NATO. Ultimately, NATO is an extension of American military power around the world, and an instrument of Western imperialism, the imperialism of an oligarchy, not of the people. And we always, I think, need to ask serious and hard questions about this claim that we need to have, and I thank you, Sam, for posing the question, that we need to have a military at all in this country. If there's any country in the world that could probably do without a military, it's Canada. So let's move on then to the question of austerity. And you mentioned the cut to the civil service, Radhika. Mark Carney's government hasn't been shy about warning us that this budget would be an austerity budget. That's what members of his cabinet described it as in the days leading up to this release of the budget. It's projecting that the Canadian civil service will be reduced from 368,000 to 330,000 by the end of 2028 to 2029, the fiscal year 2028-2029. The budget boasts that the Carney government will put direct program expenses on a sustainable track. I'm going to show you a chart that I picked out of the budget. Maybe, Radhika, you can help us to make sense of this. And it shows the compound annual growth rate for direct program expenses. I'm not sure what that is. It was from 2014 to 2025, the compound annual growth rate was 8.1%. This budget will bring it down for 2025 to 2030 to 0.5%. So there will be an increase over that period in direct program expenses, but it'll be very modest, and far less than it was over the preceding decade. So, Radhika, could you talk to us about the spending cuts in this budget and how you think they're likely to impact ordinary Canadians?
Yeah, so first of all, in this chart, I mean, what you have to understand is that the 8.1% compound annual growth rate was kind of more real when it was taking place between 2014 and 2024, because in most of this period, inflation was relatively low. In the last, well, since about 2021, 2022, it began to go up. So in real terms, it was lower. The new rate, the 0.5 rate, will be, it's already very low, and it will be even lower with the current inflation. So the austerity is in the, not in outright cuts, but in the low rate of growth of program expenditures, particularly in a context where the need is much greater. We are looking at social programs at the end of a decade, in fact, several decades already of cuts and so on. So there is no doubt that whether it is the health service or education or universities or whatever, everything needs more money, and this is all going to cut it. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. The second thing, and by the way, I should just say that Yves is on his computer, so as soon as he appears, we can also include him a bit more. But let me, Yves, we don't see you yet. Okay, the other thing is that, you said several things about defense expenditure, and here's Yves. So I'll just say a couple of things and then let Yves kick in. But you see, to me, defense expenditure and then debt and deficit. First of all, you said that, Yves formulated it perfectly when he said that Canada's military is not for defense, it is for aiding American imperialism abroad. And in this context, it's very important to underline that in the popular discourse, we are always told that NATO is some kind of opposition to the Warsaw Pact. No, when NATO was created, there was no Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact did not come into being until, and get this, until Germany joined NATO in 1954. That's when the Warsaw Pact was created. NATO was not an opposition to the Warsaw Pact. NATO was an opposition to the United Nations, because Western imperialist powers did not wish to be treated on par or treated as equals of the vast majority of the rest of the world's countries. They have resented the United Nations since its foundation for that reason, and NATO was their workaround for the United Nations. And I'll just say one other thing and then hand over to Yves, because I'm sure he has a lot more to say. But in this context, essentially, this government is treating, as they say, every crisis is an opportunity, and it is definitely exploiting this crisis, the crisis caused by Trump's tariffs, in order to give more corporate giveaways. Because in the name of, getting productivity up, spending on infrastructure, spending on defense, all these things that, it thinks that everybody else will agree on, it is basically planning enormous corporate giveaways. And that is, to me, exactly what neoliberalism has always been about.
So Yves, let's bring you in here, and I invite you just to comment generally on, share your thoughts with us about the austerity aspects of this budget. But one thing I'm particularly interested in, because you are running to be the leader of the NDP, and the NDP is supposed to be the champion of labor. And as I indicated at the outset, we're looking at a huge cut in the size of the federal civil service, something which I'm sure the organized labor is very unhappy about, very concerned about. So I'd like you to start by just sort of commenting on how you think the NDP should react to this budget, not just to the slashing of the civil service, but other aspects of the budget. And what are your overall thoughts about the austerity aspects of this budget?
Yeah, well, I think the NDP reaction is actually stunning, in that I haven't seen anything from anybody in the NDP leadership race or from the party itself critical of the military element. That, to me, is absolutely remarkable. It's I would say a little surprising. That comes from somebody who's been very critical of the NDP's militarism and alignment with imperialism. But the fact that it's just absolutely crystal clear that this military expansion it doesn't just come at the expense of the world, but it comes at the expense of things that the NDP says it upholds, which is things like, good jobs in the federal service and social programs and Canada Post, all these things that Carney is going at hard. He's completely gutting Canada Post, and he's 40,000 job losses in the federal service is I think something like 13% or 14%. It's quite significant. And so the NDP is willing to say we don't agree with these cuts in the federal service, but they're not willing to point out the military side, and that to me is it's embarrassing. It's kind of startling. Now, with regard, it's obviously in the context of economic instability that in part comes from Donald Trump's policies. It seems like a very imprudent move to cut large amounts of jobs in the federal service. That doesn't seem like a very smart move in the context of a difficult economic situation, because obviously, you need to have public spending to maintain some stability in the economy and whatnot. So I don't fully understand that element. Obviously, there is significant deficits. The fact that Carney completely cowered to Trump in getting rid of the digital services tax on the big, U.S. Tech companies, that was billions of dollars foregone. The cutting of the capital gains, that was billions of dollars foregone. There's all kinds of policies that Carney could have pursued that would have cut into the deficit in a way that would have been much more just in terms of targeting major corporations and the wealthy, rather than cutting the federal service and cutting Canada Post. So that's some of that. Now, also things like just the cutting of the trees program. That's another part of like Carney. If you look at his climate, they've completely downgraded the climate targets, the 2030 and 2035 climate targets, which were already far from sufficient. And now they're cutting the trees program. They're supposed to build grow 2 billion new trees that Trudeau committed to. They're cutting that, and they're calling for more pipelines, right? And they're willing to trample on Indigenous rights with the Bill C-5 in putting more fossil fuel infrastructure. And if you look at the tar sands and the constant expansion of the tar sands, there's just this is a total crime against the climate, against humanity's capacity to survive long term, and it goes at part of the whole security question too, right? We're spending all this money on the military to supposedly to protect us from this, the Russians or the Chinese or Iran or some other boogeyman, and yet you have hundreds of thousands of people that are being displaced in forest fires that are in part, climate induced. All the evidence suggests the forest fires are getting worse, and they even cut. There's even 15% cut in the warning system around like extreme weather stuff. That was a cut came back previously. So a lot of these things, they just don't add up. It only adds up if the point here is to placate Donald Trump, right? And what's also remarkable, I kind of alluded to it, but it's remarkable is people, including people on the left, that will frame the military spending as like a defense of Trump's annexation threats, when again, the Canadian military, like David Puglisi has just detailed this in depth over the past 6 months, contrasting the public opinion saying, hey, we want less ties to the U.S., this whole business of, boycotting traveling to the U.S., boycotting, groceries from the U.S., whatnot. And yet all the chief of the defense staff, all the hierarchy of the Canadian military, they are just acting like nothing is going on. And they're just trying to deepen the ties to the U.S. military. As the president talks about annexing Canada, they themselves do not view their role as defense. They themselves view, and this is well documented for many years, they view themselves as expanding the U.S. empire. And there's also this establishment, these two establishments, University of Ottawa, commentators have a book coming out. I haven't read the book, but the Globe Mail talked about it last week, about they contrast 15 different countries' militaries and how much democratic oversight there is. And they conclude that the Canadian military is right at the bottom, which is in large part because they work behind the scenes, behind the political operatives. They deepen their ties to the U.S., and they basically ignore what even the political directives of their ostensible bosses.
Right.
If I may jump in, if you don't mind, Dimitri.
No, by all means, go ahead.
Yeah, because what you said, Yves, it just reminded me of so many important points that I wanted to make. So first of all, I mean, in no particular order, let me just point out that the Financial Times, of all people, ran a story about Carney's budget and who prepared it. And essentially, they are reporting that he has got people from Goldman Sachs. After all, he used to work for Goldman Sachs to do this. He appointed people like Doug Guzman, former managing director of Goldman Sachs. Canada's energy minister, Tim Hodgson, also worked for Goldman Sachs, etc. And Doug Ford apparently claimed that that was the right thing to do. But they also then quote somebody who says that if you are talking about growing the real economy, and remember, that's what Carney is talking about. He's saying that his purpose in this budget, his long-time transformational goal in this budget is to improve Canada's productivity, to make generational investments for Canada's future, and all these sorts of things. And here's this guy saying, if you're talking about growing the real economy, Goldman's financiers should not be allowed in the building, let alone a seat at the table. They have repeatedly failed at everything they do connected with the productive economy. And this could not be more true, because in so many of the, basically, so many of the, I've underlined many times that the kind of finance that Goldman Sachs do is the absolute opposite of what you need for a productive economy, for industrial investment, let alone an egalitarian economy, etc., etc. So that's the first point. Secondly, what Yves, you said about Canada's military, it's so interesting, and you are absolutely right. And this is also, of course, true, or rather what you say is true about Canada's military is true because Canada's ruling class is of a certain sort. Back in the 1970s, there were a number of voices that pointed out that Canada was becoming too reliant on the United States, that we should diversify away from the United States, etc. And all these voices were silenced, and instead we got the 1988 Canada-US free trade deal. So going back nearly, I guess that would be 40 years, Canada has hitched its wagon to the United States. And it is not going to, it's not just that it's hard to undo the extremely deep engagement that Canada has with the United States economy, that economic interdependence is so great. It's also the fact that Canada's ruling class has oriented itself towards the United States throughout this period. In fact, through the whole post-independence, post-war period. And so in this context, there is no way that you're going to get an independent voice. Carney campaigned on standing up to Trump. He has done nothing of the sort. And finally, I guess I just want to say that that is why what you are seeing here in this budget is essentially a way of giving more corporate giveaways to the corporate sector. That is the essence of neoliberalism. That is the essence of that is to say, neoliberalism is about keeping corporate power and privilege. Sorry, you're muted, Dimitri.
Well, if I can jump in there too, and just on some of the other economic side and Trump, that's important to focus on. Now, Carney was just in Asia. He had a quick meeting with President Xi, and he's supposed to go to China I think I don't know exactly when, but sometime in coming months. And the plan is to double trade exports, non-US exports. But the Canadian ruling class really boxed themselves in with their anti-China kind of policies, and obviously in large part it stems from going along with the detention of Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei back in 2018, which was on just totally ridiculous grounds, completely about serving the U.S. But they undercut their relations with China at the behest of Washington effectively, and that's become a big problem for Carney, for the Liberals. It always divided the capitalist class. There was always a sector of Canada's capitalist class that wanted to continue with relations with China, and they understood this was self-defeating. But ultimately, they were basically defeated by the broader capitalist class working with the U.S. And now they're sort of scrambling to restart ties. And just in the Globe today, there's a story about how China put Canada back on the list of tours for Chinese tourists, and after 2019 they'd taken Canada off, and led to hundreds of thousands of fewer Chinese tourists in Canada. And this was one of the successes of the meeting between Carney and Xi a few days ago. And there's obviously the whole question of canola, and there's stories about the canola farmers in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and I think it's been in Manitoba, that they have all this seed that they haven't been able to export to China. And then this is all because, of course, Canada brought in the tariffs on the electric vehicles from China, and at the behest of the Biden administration. So Canada's in a tight spot geopolitically. They've so much absorbed the Washington geopolitical perspective that they can't. It is difficult to enhance trade relations with the BRICS, and specifically China, because they've sort of subordinated the geopolitical perspective to Washington. And then Trump goes and undercuts Canada economically. And so exactly as you're saying, Radhika, I mean, the sort of left nationalist perspective on the free trade agreement with the U.S. Back 35 years ago, it's completely come to pass, where there's just the level of dependence on the U.S. has hit a state where there's just so much leverage. And then you have a Donald Trump that's willing to employ that leverage in the most kind of crass ways, and they're sort of caught into a box. Now, I think in the context of this instability from the U.S., one of the things the Canadian government could and should do is, massive. You're talking about like nation building, massive public investment into social and co-op housing, right? Build hundreds and hundreds of thousands of units of co-op housing. This would be a kind of a nation exercise, or even for that matter, expand rather than cutting Canada Post. Canada Post has maybe that the mail is down from its high point 20 years ago, but Canada Post, the infrastructure of Canada Post, could be involved in postal banking. Many countries' post offices are engaged in postal banking, and Canada Post actually engages in some of it already. This is something that's been on the table for many years, but it's the big banks don't want that, and so Canada Post doesn't go in that direction. So there's all kinds of if you were into genuine nation building, if you were willing to do it outside of the lens of just the interests of capital and the interests of the corporations and a sort of neoliberal lens, there's things like massive housing program, expanding Canada Post. These are kind of things that would be exactly what a sort of nation building, anti-Trump, mildly social democratic government could and should do.
Yeah, and also invest massively in domestic production of things that are necessary for the well-being of Canadians, like pharmaceutical products. We used to have a state-owned pharmaceutical, an excellent world-class pharmaceutical manufacturer of Conrad Labs, and that was privatized, I believe, by Brian Mulroney, the conservative prime minister of the 80s. So there are many, many industries that we can and should develop in order to make Canada truly independent and self-sustaining. This government appears to have little to no interest in doing that, except with perhaps the exception being the energy industry, the oil industry. Now, before we move off the subject of military spending, I just wanted to share with you all a video of our good friend Tamara Lorentz, a peace activist who was kicked off of X, so she can't share this video with you herself on social media, but she was at the Ritzy Empire Club in Toronto 10 days ago, where the Canadian Defense Minister, David McGuinty, was bragging about his massive, gargantuan increases in military spending, surrounded by, adoring generals and other military types. Listen to what Tamara had to say, and check out the smug looks on the faces of the military types as she lets her views be known.
We're in a poverty crisis and a climate crisis! We can't afford military spending! Canadians need housing, healthcare, and high-speed rail! We don't need weapons, we need peace! Tell the truth about the war in Ukraine! Tell the truth, it's a NATO proxy war! It's a NATO proxy war!
Yes, indeed it is. It is a NATO proxy war. Well said, Tamara. So let's move on then to this rather prodigious deficit that the Canadian government is now going to have to manage. And I'm going to show you a chart that I picked out of this budget. And it shows the projected deficit for 2025, 2026, $78 billion, and then declining to $65 billion, this projection, of course, in the following fiscal year, down to $57 billion in 5 years' time. So even in 5 years' time, it would be at $57 billion. And, the Canadian government likes to tout the fact that relative to other members of the G7, Canada has a low debt to GDP ratio. I think that's fair to say that, but it doesn't like to compare itself to other countries, significant economies, which have even lower levels of debt relative to GDP. But with that as background, let's start with you, Radhika. What are your views about, given the investments the government has chosen to make, given the austerity aspects of this budget? It's actually quite surprising that they're characterizing a budget with some justification as being an austerity budget when they're going to be spending so much more than they're bringing in. Do you think that these deficits are sustainable? And if you think that they're sustainable, do you nonetheless think that running these deficits are going to have negative impacts on the government's ability in the future to deliver essential services to the people?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think the government's priority has never been to deliver essential services to people. It has always been to deliver essential services to the corporate Canadian capitalist class. So having said that, I think the deficit, whether deficits are sustainable or not, will be a judgment that bond markets will make. I think so far, the Canadian government, partly because of the austerity we kind of went through back in the 1990s, with the Chrétien government and cutting the, that was Canada's version of sort of, the Liberal Party accepting the neoliberal nostrums and so on. So since that time, we have been cutting and so on. So our deficit debt to GDP ratio, etc., is relatively tolerable. So we may get away with it. But the point is that this government is expanding the debt, the deficit, etc., in order to give, as I say, in order to use this crisis as an opportunity to give more corporate giveaways. And it is very careful to cut spending in other directions, like the tree planting program or other, and the very, very small increase in social program spending and so on. So in real terms, this constitutes a cut. So in that sense, it is an austerity budget. And the government is spending more because, you see, at the end of the day, I think that I mean, the government spending more is not a huge problem as far as the government is concerned. If they can spend more by leaving a debt burden for future generations of Canadians, they're happy to do so, because it's ordinary Canadians who are going to have to pay for it in the future. Meanwhile, at the moment, the corporate class can enjoy its bonanzas. So I really don't think that this is okay, Canada is in a relatively favorable position compared to other countries. I mean, in Britain, we are going to see a budget which is further along the line in terms of, the deterioration, because let me also mention that the Canadian deficit projections will only be sustained if a whole bunch of other conditions apply. Number one, as I've already said, this budget is very low on specifics, and we don't know whether there will be down the line, expansions in spending of any kind. Number two, we don't know if there will be further tax giveaways to big corporations, both of which can increase the deficit. And number three, we don't know that this big gamble that Carney is making on the fact that he's going to spend X billion dollars on infrastructure and on stimulating the economy and so on, and that the corporate sector will step up. I mean, I'm reminded, as a scholar also of UK politics, I'm reminded that back in the early 70s, when the crisis first hit Western countries, Edward Heath, who was the Prime Minister of Britain, was reduced to begging the members of the Confederation of British Industry to start investing. He said, look, I've done my part. I've restrained the unions. I've cut spending. I've blah, blah, etc. Now it's your turn to do your bit. You must invest. But the whole problem is, throughout this 50 plus years, the Western economies and Western policymakers have created an environment in which there is no investment. Partly, I mean, policymakers have done this by essentially restricting demand. If you don't put enough money in the pockets of ordinary people, there's not going to be enough demand. And of course, business itself has been reluctant to spend, because it is happier making money in financial markets than by making money by investing in production, which is what really creates the jobs.
Now, lastly, I want to talk about the political reaction to this, and I'm going to bring you here, Yves. But before I do that, I want to just share with our audience what the preliminary responses were of the main opposition parties, the largest being the Conservative Party, and its leader, Pierre Poilievre, whom I affectionately refer to as the yapping Zionist Chihuahua, told the Commons that his MPs would not vote for this budget. This is what he said today, quote, "The Liberals have introduced the most costly and largest budget deficit in Canadian history outside of COVID. The cost of this Liberal budget will drive up the cost of food, housing, and everything else Canadians buy. Conservatives will not be able to support this budget." Then comes the Bloc Québécois leader, Yves-François Blanchet. For those of you who don't know Canadian politics too well, the Bloc Québécois is a federal party, but it only runs candidates in the province of Quebec. And its stated mission is to defend the interests of the province of Quebec, where I'm situated, by the way. And it makes no bones about the fact that it isn't, seeking to serve the national interest. It's all about Quebec interests. And they said, the leader said, quote, "This is a red conservative budget, which Mr. Harper might have signed," that being the last conservative prime minister, Stephen Harper. "And there is nothing in there for Quebecers," he said. That sounds like a pretty definitive rejection too. And then finally, we come to the party for which our friend Yves Engler seeks the leadership, the NDP, New Democratic Party, and it is currently being spoken for by interim leader Don Davies. And by the way, I know Don. Don, I think, is a good guy, but I have some issues with Don's response. He praised the budget's investment in infrastructure, but raised some concerns about the coming cuts. He said his 7-member caucus will meet Wednesday to discuss how to approach the budget vote, which could include abstaining. So he's the one who sounds least hawkish of the three. And just so people, again, who are not familiar with Canadian politics, the configuration in Canada's parliament right now, correct me if I'm wrong, Yves and Radhika, but I believe even with the paltry 7 seats, the NDP would be enough
Yes.
to carry the day with the
They just need 3 votes. And in fact, with the Nova Scotia MP's defection, they need only 2 more votes.
Okay. So today, another in the Hill Times, Don Davies was quoted as saying that Canadians don't want an election. And if I had $1 for every time I heard Canadians don't want an election by an opposition leader, I'd be richer than Bill Gates. So here's my response to that before I ask you to chime in here, Yves. First of all, to the extent that this claim is based upon polls, the Canadians don't want an election, those polls were done before Canadians knew what was in this damn budget. So the real question is, first of all, what would Canadians want if they were informed about this budget? Would they rather have the budget or would they rather have an election? So there's no poll out there at this point which answers that question. But secondly, even if there was a poll which answered that question, and the answer was we'd rather have, we'd rather avoid an election, still, at the end of the day, the NDP has, I think, an obligation to act in the long-term interests of the country. And secondly, they could go to the voters and say, we demanded changes to this budget. We tried to avoid an election, but they simply said no. They refused to make any accommodation. For example, they stuck to their guns about this vast, slashing of the civil service and so forth. They refused to increase their spending on social housing, blah, blah, blah. And so it's not our fault that there's an election. It's the Liberals' fault. And they could make that case. And, if they had the courage of their convictions. So I don't find any of this persuasive. When I hear people like Don Davies say, it's nice a guy as Don is, Canadians don't want an election, that's really just passing the buck. And so with that as background, Yves, what do you think the NDP should do? If you were the leader today, what would you do about this budget?
Oh, there's no way in the world that I would support this budget. And to repeat myself, like it's the military side that's just so straightforward on this. There's no way that you can morally justify this level of increased military spending. And the NDP is just unwilling to even mention the issue. It's remarkable. And so that's absolutely crystal clear. And there's, I agree with you completely. It's not just a question of there's other things that should be in the budget. I mean, we should be getting to a proper national daycare program where everyone has daycare at $10 a day. Is sort of been some steps in that direction. So I think it's absolutely clear the NDP should vote against this and they shouldn't abstain. It's a really important point that all they need to do is a couple NDP MPs abstain, and that's enough for the Liberals. And there's already been talk about doing that. So not wanting to get the wrath of having voted for it, and just but have a couple MPs vote against it, and then a few MPs abstain, and that's enough for it to get passed. I think the NDP, part of the NDP's issue is that the party's bankrupt. They had a catastrophic last election, which led to millions of dollars in debt that was unexpected because they didn't hit the threshold to get the public funding to repay part of the costs that were outlaid in different ridings. So the party's in a serious financial mess. And so there's some degree of fear. I don't think that's a smart calculation, because I do actually think the NDP could get a few of the seats that they lost, and they have a chance of getting party status, which requires 12 MPs. So I think there are some electoralist reasons for the NDP to be happy to have a new election. And I agree with you that I'm sure if you ask people, do you want a winter Christmas time just after Christmas election, most people will probably say no. But if it's put in the context of, well, do you want 13% of the federal service to be cut, or do you want a huge increase in military spending, or do you want a tax against some climate mitigation, or do you want more giveaways to the corporate sector? Are you willing to have an election with all those things? And I think that all of a sudden you'd find that people are not so hostile to having an election. So I think the NDP, we knew that the Conservatives, put out some demands that they knew weren't going to be attained. The demand was the 42 billion, I believe it was, for a deficit can't be above 42 billion, and they knew that the government wasn't going to reach that. And the Bloc put out some demands, which the Bloc demands specifically around the old age assistance was a very good demand, which the Liberals didn't fulfill. The NDP was more vague in terms of laying out what they needed in the budget, do individual MPs who are currently in those positions, they have maybe their own personal self-interest and not want a new election. Some of those dynamics probably play into it. The leadership race is a little bit of an issue there. I just to put it out there, I personally see this as a beneficial thing for my campaign. So I want an election. I want to run in the Hochelaga Rising. So I understand that maybe my opinion here is being colored by my own, personal interest in this. But yeah, so I think that the NDP unequivocally should vote against this warfare budget.
Yeah, Yves, Jagmeet Singh, the former NDP leader, propped up the minority government of Justin Trudeau. And as you mentioned, they got annihilated in the last election. Now, maybe we can't establish definitively that a large part of the reason why they got annihilated was that they were propping up this extraordinarily unpopular, prime minister and government. But I think that it's very plausible that was a major contributing factor. And it just blows my mind that the NDP seems poised to do this again. That right after taking a beating, after propping up a Liberal government, they seem poised to be ready to prop up a Liberal government again. What do you think about all this, Radhika? Do you think that this? Do you think there is something to that? That the reason why the NDP got thrashed in the last election, or at least part of the reason, was because it sold out to the Liberal government?
Well, first of all, there's everything to that. I think that is indeed why they got. They sold out. Why they got trashed. But also, I just wanted to go back to some of the earlier questions that you were asking. So, first of all, in terms of the opposition parties' reactions, I agree with Yves that the Bloc had put forward some decent proposals. But as far as the Conservatives were concerned, not only were they going through the ritual of opposing the government, as they must, because there is no other way that that is how they are going to try and create their own constituency. So they had to do that. And what's more, they criticized the budget for not being even more of an austerity budget. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the NDP, I think that, actually neither the Conservatives nor the NDP want another election. They do not, at the where they stand right now in the polls and what have you, there is absolutely no indication that they are going to benefit from any election that takes place right now. Things have just not moved forward that much. So if we have an election, we very likely get a very similar result as last time. Maybe with some small differences, because none of the other stuff has changed. I think what's most remarkable is that here we can all three of us agree, and many others, millions of Canadians would agree with us, that we need to redirect our economy away from the United States. We need to fund productive investment. We need to fund social services. We need to expand the domestic market. We need to invest in healthcare, education, etc. All of these things are a crying need. None of the major, and we do not need to increase military spending. None of the major parties, even the tiny NDP, are in favor of that. What we have is something that is plaguing all the Western world, is a political establishment that is completely disconnected, kind of, uprooted from the grassroots of politics of our societies. And so we have, ordinary Canadians are fed up to hear of Trump. They voted for Carney in order that he would stand up to Trump. None of this has happened. Nothing has happened that that would fulfill the needs of Canadians. And so we really have a profoundly problematic political scenario, and this Canada shares with the rest of the Western world, except the rest of the West, Canada is a bit behind the curve. What we'll see next month in Rachel Reeves' budget is really more like it, where they don't even have any room to borrow more money. So what are they going to do? This is going to be really interesting, and this is going to be a really painful budget, even more painful than ours.
This is a little bit off topic, but one of our commenters, Daniel, said, join BRICS. Now, it's an interesting idea. So we're not anywhere close to that, I think, in the terms of the orientation of the political elite of Canada. Something that should be seriously discussed. And obviously the United States would go absolutely ballistic if Canada were even have a serious discussion about that. But it does appear that Carney is, it's not anywhere close to, seeking a place within BRICS, but it appears that he is trying to improve relations with China and India. And I'm curious what you both think of that. Do you think that Carney has it in him to seriously reorient Canada's trade away from the West, particularly the United States and Europe, and towards the leading economies in the BRICS? I'll start with you. Go ahead, Radhika, and then Yves, please.
Sure. So I'd say I really don't think so. I know that Carney was in all these Asian capitals and so on. However, I think that this is really a kind of a coping mechanism, so to speak. I think that in the budget, what Carney speaks of is reorienting to Europe and to what he calls the Indo-Pacific. To use the very term Indo-Pacific is to indicate that he does not wish to foreground China. If you wish to have closer relations, if you really wish to accept the multipolar world, the first thing Canada has to do is stop the war in Ukraine. The first thing Canada has to do is to reorient to China most fundamentally. And secondly, it has to stop the war in Ukraine, neither of which Carney seems to be willing to do. So he seems to live in a world, because see, at the end of the day, Carney must be understood as a sort of Bidenite. And Bidenite in two senses of the term. On the one hand, he represents what people may call the neoliberal global establishment, but at the same time, he's also a Bidenite in the sense that when Biden came to office, he continued many of Trump's policies. He did not abandon them. So what's happening is a reconfiguration of the world of Western metropolitan capitalism, in which the extreme right, represented by Trump, is allowed to pull the political spectrum even further to the right, in ways that this liberal establishment, neoliberal establishment, cannot resist. And I think Carney is a member of that group by his personal inclinations, but I think personal inclinations don't count. But I also think that the Canadian ruling class is a member, fully paid up member of that group. And that is why we will not see any genuine BRICS membership or anything. We will have Asia, Indo-Pacific orientation, etc., which is Japan, it's South Korea, it's etc. So, as I put it recently, I forget what it was, something I wrote or something I said, but if Canada ends up accepting the multipolar world, if Canada ends up accepting BRICS, etc., it will only do that kind of, it'll be dragged into doing that because of objective circumstances, but it will do it only kicking and screaming.
And, by the way, this idea that we should be deepening our ties with Europe at a time when Europe is in rapid economic decline, what planet does this man live on? I just can't make any sense of his reorientation of Canadian trade towards Europe. Yves, if you were the leader of the NDP, what would you do about BRICS? What would your attitude towards BRICS be, and what policies would you advocate for in relation to the BRICS countries?
Well, just before that, Carney, when he went off maybe a month, 6 weeks in, when he was sort of anti-Trump, went to Europe and did a quick trip to Europe. To me, it was very racist, because we have more ties with Mexico, right? Why wouldn't you go to Mexico City? What's with going to Paris and London? It's very much kind of like fits within the sort of history of settler colonialism, and it doesn't really make sense economically, but it does make sense from a certain kind of political, racial kind of dynamic. And I totally agree that, Canada was a founder. It was Britain, Canada, and the US that founded NATO in 1948 when they began the discussions, secret meetings. Canada's a part of the Five Eyes. So, the notion of Canada in any way leading the charge towards BRICS is just not plausible. We talk about, in our platform, we do talk about BRICS. I think it should be out there. It should be part of the discussion. Jeff Rubin in the Globe Mail report on business today, I read my flight to Halifax, read back issues, I don't know, the last couple of weeks. He had a column where he does talk about it. He had previously raised the BRICS. And I think it should be discussed. I think it should be part of a pushback against Trump. But I would actually be prudent in the kind of dimension of, I would never, I think it would be very irresponsible mistake for Canada to go too far with some of that, because what the reaction would be from the U.S. And I think we have to ultimately be clear-eyed about that. I think Mark Carney should openly and aggressively condemn the war on Venezuela right now. I think Mark Carney should come out critical of U.S. policy and blowing up ships all over the Caribbean and now on the Pacific side and things like that. I think we should end things like Operation Caribe, where Canadian naval vessels participating in the so-called war on drugs, the Americans. We should NORAD. We should get out of NORAD. And one of the things NORAD does is in the last about 35 years ago began having a war on drugs kind of focus. So we're definitely engaged in assisting the U.S. With intelligence on their operations, these clearly illegal operations that are part of a regime change effort in Venezuela. So we should definitely get out of NORAD. I believe we should get out of NATO. But there should be some degree of awareness. We should push it as far as we can. And we should obviously work with the people in the U.S. that are like-minded, that want to see the U.S. empire fall. But we should also be realistic in terms of, we don't want the backlash that could get to the point of, a U.S. invasion or stuff like that. And so, these discussions definitely should be had. But, right now we're in a position, just with the NDP. The NDP hasn't even criticized 2 months of U.S. war, low-level war in Venezuela that looks like it might escalate to something even worse. You could criticize. The rationale here, the American supposed rationale, is the fentanyl or drugs coming from Venezuela, which there's obviously no fentanyl coming from Venezuela. This seems to be a very small amount of cocaine that goes from Colombia and Ecuador via Venezuela. But that was the same rationale that Trump was going after Canada. That's why we set up our fentanyl czar there, in the early months of Trump. And so you could totally criticize what the U.S. is doing in Venezuela from a kind of left nationalist Canadian perspective and frame it as it's just Donald Trump. But the NDP is not even willing to make that criticism, and not the NDP, none of the other leadership candidates, even Avi Lewis is not willing to come out and make that criticism of Trump's policy towards Venezuela. So we're many, many steps away from a proper discussion of the BRICS. This is we have to be clear about how subservient we are to the U.S. empire's geopolitical view of the world. The Palestine, in fact, is the exception. We're seeing that, because of all the activism in Palestine, we've had the NDP come out and be willing to, be critical. But the general ethos is to cheer on the NATO proxy war, is to cheer on the NDP has been worse on China than the Liberals, on Iran, even on things like on Haiti. I mean, so it's there needs to be a anti-imperialist, critical look at Canadian foreign policy, and the reality is that view is way off in the fringes.
Yeah, I just want to offer a legal perspective on what's being done in offshore Venezuela. This is blatant violation of international law and basic legal principles of the United States itself. If these people were on American soil, trafficking in narcotics, first of all, they would not be subject to the death penalty, even though the U.S. has the death penalty. Capital punishment is not reserved for drug traffickers. It's reserved for more serious crimes. And here, they're basically, Trump is imposing by individual fiat the death penalty on these people. And secondly, there's no due process. They've not been charged with anything. They've not been convicted of anything. There's been no attempt made to arrest them. I think one of the boats, the Colombian vessel, a couple of people survived, and rather than seek to arrest them, the Americans just said, go back to Colombia. So they're just making a mockery of due process, habeas corpus, basic principles of the U.S. justice system, and flagrantly violating international law. And you don't have to, don the mantle of anti-imperialism to criticize this. You don't have to pose as a political radical. This is just some basic, principles of due process that are at stake here. So it's really quite shocking that these leadership candidates in a nominally left-wing party are not willing to vigorously criticize this. There's nothing radical about that critique at all. I mean, even Rand Paul is criticizing this, for Christ's sakes. The Republican senator, Volker Turk, one of the top human rights officials in the United Nations, is criticizing this. So it is rather distressing to see how weak-kneed the left has become, at least what I would call the mainstream left. There's plenty of honest, courageous leftists in this country. I'm speaking to two of them, as a matter of fact, in this live stream. So with that, I think we'll close it out. But Yves, before we do that, could you tell everybody where you stand in your campaign? What's going on? What's next? And how can people who want to support your campaign do so?
Yeah, well, I'm doing a Maritimes tour right now of a handful more events, and then I'm going to do another Southern Ontario tour about a week, 10 days from now. We are going to be submitting formally for the vetting process within the next week. So then we will put our campaign in the hands of 3 anonymous backroom NDP vetters who get to decide if our 1,000 volunteer campaign is allowed to formally continue as part of the formal process. We have the money to pay the first installments, which was the big obstacle. They put very high financial threshold to participate, and we had a huge amount of success fundraising, and then they used that against us and suggest that we were doing something dubious in our fundraising, which is not true whatsoever.
Just to remind people, that threshold was $100,000, right?
$100,000 and some more, but yeah, $100,000, and so we.
Sorry to interrupt, but I mean, if that doesn't prove there's a lot of grassroots support for your candidacy, I mean, for you to raise $100,000, and you did that without being able to offer to people the tax credit because you're not yet vetted as a candidate. They knew they weren't going to get a tax credit, and they donated to your campaign anyways. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, and I should say, to be clear, we're about 90,000, but we've kind of stopped fundraising for the last 3 weeks because, unfortunately, because their attack pieces, their smear jobs on us on this question has kind of made it a little bit more difficult for us. But yes, no doubt, we've done that without access to the NDP list. All the contacts, we've done that without being able to provide the tax credits. We've done that without being allowed to participate in the different forums. We had remarkable, I was stunned by how quick We were able to raise $85,000 in under 3 weeks, and it unequivocally shows. The last leadership race, it was $30,000 threshold. They raised that to $100,000 in part because they're bankrupt, but in part also to keep out left insurgent candidacies. And then we show the success on that front, and then they basically suggest that we're fundraising in a dubious way. So there is significant support. There's significant support. The anti-imperialist ideas are way off on the margins, even within the NDP, is the reality. And what we've shown is there's actually many, many thousands of Canadians, we don't know how many, but many, many thousands that actually want these ideas right at the center of the politics. And so we've been able to have more success than expected. And in terms of ongoing, people should check out the platform. You can see that at ndp2026.ca, and then on our campaign's website, Eve for NDP Leader, people can sign up to volunteer, people can sign up to receive messages, people can donate, people can there's different groups, local groups, people can plug in all kinds of different ways.
And do you have to be a member of the NDP to donate?
You don't have to be a member of the NDP to donate. We're following Elections Canada rules, so there's a maximum of 1,750 donations. But you can donate no matter whether you're a member. Now, to vote in the leadership race, you do, of course, have to be a member. You can become a member for as little as $5. So I would invite people, even though we're at this point not formally in, we hope to formally be in. But I invite people to become members so they can vote in the vote, which will take place at the end of March.
And lastly, what's the deadline for them to become a member so that they can vote? Do you know that date?
Yeah, it's 2 months before, so it's late January.
Okay, great. Well, we'll end it there, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us at this relatively late hour. We thought we usually hold our live streams much earlier in the day, but we wanted to have a chance to digest this gigantic budget. And needless to say, we all now have a case of indigestion. So with that, we'll sign off. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to our next live stream.
Thanks, Aaron.